We're going to continue the conversation, and we're going to invite a couple more up on stage. We've got Ingeborg Volan. She is the audience editor, right, at Dagens Næringsliv. And Erik Knudsen, a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Information Science and Media Studies at the University of Bergen. That was a long one.
We just thought we'd pull ourselves together a bit.
Yes, we are pulling ourselves together. It feels like trying to have a conversation. And I would like to start with you, Ingeborg. What do you think of Lynn's suggestions? And are you doing any of those, or are you doing other things that you find have been useful?
Well, my first reflection on this was that I'm really glad I'm not an elected official. But yeah, these action points feel really familiar, and I think a lot of us are doing some of it. But I think the realization that a lot of what we are taking for granted as part of our profession, we're not communicating well enough, is really important and really insightful. And it's also possible to address. I've read probably a couple of 100,000 reader or audience comments in my time. And it's remarkable what happens once you appear as a person with a name in a comment section, in how people who were maybe ranting against a faceless organization, whether it's the NRK or Dagens Næringsliv, like, oh, you guys are just hell-bent on taking this angle and you're trying to get this elected official thrown out, or blah, 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 blah. And you come up and say, oh, well, thank you for caring so much. This is how we thought when we did it. Maybe this point didn't get quite through. Here's a link to another story we did. And please email me if you have everything. And you get these wonderful responses. And saying, oh, wow, I didn't expect that anyone actually read this. So that feeling of being approachable, I think, is so incredibly important. Approachable and human.
Are you getting all the journalists to do this at Dagens Næringsliv?
We are working on it. I will say that when we get it right, it really works. We had a really good example last week. We've been covering for a while a story about how the Minister for Finance is renting a cabin from one of Norway's richest men, and how she hasn't reported this to the Parliament's Oversight Committee. And we have been getting a lot of feedback from readers, both on email and social media and everything, about, oh, you are just out to get her. This is how you always cover the Progress Party, and so on and so on. And when you take the time to explain that, you know what? We really think that when the National Minister for Finance has a business relationship with Norway's wealthiest man, that has nothing to do with what party she's from, but her position in the government. And it doesn't get through to everyone, but we really see that the tone in the comment section or the tone in the email changes dramatically the moment we show our faces there. And when that's even signed with a name and a title from within the organization, like when our news editor comes into the comment section and says, you know what, this is what we were thinking, this is how we calculated that. It really changes things.
So we kind of like to think that we are different to the US and you can't really compare us to each other. But Erik, is it possible to compare US and the US and Norwegian media in this way? Can we sort of learn from this and do the same things?
We can, but it's important to...
Is it working?
It's important to...
I think there's a mic coming.
Is it working now? Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah?
It's important also to keep in mind that the situation is quite different. I mean, there's been some studies that looked at the trends. So for the US, it's very true that it's a downgoing trend, but that is not at all a universal picture. I mean, the US, it's the outlier, not the typical case. So looking to the US and saying that trust in media is in some kind of crisis, I mean, you can't really generalize from the US to Norway. But still, it doesn't mean that we should take it easy and say that everything is fine in Norway. It's just that you can't directly compare the situation in the US and the trend, the downgoing trend with Norwegian situation.
But you've actually done a very fresh study now comparing sort of the triggers of trust
Yes.
in US and Norway.
That is true.
Can you sort of say, I think we can put up a little slide showing a little bit of what, there we go. Can we do this in do it in the way that, what was it you said, in the way that your grandmother would understand?
Yes.
Yes.
And so the tone of voice and explain what you've done.
Yeah. So what we see a picture of here is exactly the same as one random respondent. This is from the US study would see. So our idea was that trust in news media comprises of different determinants. And I mean, this list you see here is not exhaustive, but at least it's a quite long list. I mean, we have when it was established, whether the editor-in-chief and owner openly supports a political party or not, the amount of entertainment use, the use of advertising, comment fields, and so on.
So Norwegians were asked these.
Exact same version, yeah.
Right.
So it's
Both in US
fielded in
and
the
Norway.
Norwegian citizen panel that maybe some of you have heard of. So the point is that you have to make a choice between one of these. So you have to make a trade-off. So we got information about which one you selected to trust and which one you didn't. And if you ask a lot of respondents these questions, then you will know what are more important and what are less important as causal
Because you
determinants.
shuffle those factors around.
It's completely randomized. It's completely randomized, yes. And so, as a grandmother-ish introduction to statistics, what you will see down here at the x-axis is the effects, and it's in percentage points, which we can all read. And the y-axis over here, you would see the different determinants, the variables. And here you will see the effects. And the dots without wings are reference points. So compared to the dot without wings, you see the effect. And then you have a dot with wings. The dot is the point estimate, so the effect. And the wings are 95% confident intervals, saying something about how secure we can be of this effect. And if it goes to the left, it means a negative direction, and then if it goes to the right, it's a positive, and if it's on the same line as the zero, there's no effect.
You're following us?
And you have
Yes.
Norway, the US, and the difference between Norway and the US. Okay, let's see how this goes.
Yes.
So there's a lot of information here. But I mean, let's start at the top. I think this is interesting. So first, you see the different Norwegian parties, and beneath that, the American parties. But more importantly, you see furthest down at A there, match party endorsement. So the effect of that the party that the newspaper some kind of is either reputed to support or endorses in an election, whether that's had an effect. So the difference between being the same party, no party, or a different party. And we see that there's a quite substantial effect of it being a different party. So we don't really trust a news agency, a newspaper that disagrees with us. And keep also that in mind if you don't trust the results you see here, it's probably because you don't because you disagree with them. We see the same in the US, and there are significant differences, but not that substantial differences between the Norwegian and the US case.
So, if I understand this correctly, if you as a news media would try to show different sides to a story and show different points or the other side of it could actually make your audience distrust you?
It could. I mean, the most famous version of this would either be Fox News in the US, and without any further comparison, Klassekampen in Norway. But look at the effect of agreeing with the party. There's nothing to gain. There's only something to lose. So going in a more partisan direction, for instance, before the election, the national election, a lot of newspapers said in an editorial page that we would suggest that you vote this or this bloc or this or this party. This is this would suggest that that has a quite substantial negative effect. Moving on to ethical violations, you see, well, be ethical. And moving on to the common fields, like you were talking about, journalists participating in the common fields it's not a very good thing, but it's a good thing. And moving on to...
It looks like it's a good thing that they're participating, and having having commentary won't direct,
well, it's
but it
not
will
that
help
big
with
of
having
a
journalists
it's not that big of a
participating.
difference. It's not a significant
Right.
difference, but still it's better with journalists participating. And looking at advertising, having advertising is no problem, but having advertising that looks like news, we call that native advertising. I mean, it's a very substantial negative effect. It's almost as high as many ethical violations.
That's interesting. Is that something that you guys have seen in your kind of talking to your audience, Ingeborg?
Well, we haven't seen that directly, but there was a Norwegian study a couple of years back done by Jens Barland and Ragnhild Kristine Olsen, studying how people react with, or how people understand native advertising. And the point is that they don't. They are not able to really separate the difference. And I think that sort of addresses the point you were making earlier too, that there are so many things that we presuppose that people understand that they really don't. And it's detrimental to us if we don't take the time to understand and sort of explore that difference in understanding. I think that probably plays into something you haven't investigated here too, like do people understand the difference between opinions and reporting? Do they understand what sort of ethical guidelines guides this newspaper or this newsroom, or even the entire Norwegian press, because we actually have a national press code. And all those other things that we take for granted, like there are people producing the news, and like the idea that this is an institution with an agenda. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Is this similar? Do you recognize sort of when you see the U.S. development? Is native advertising, for example, and
Yeah, so native advertising is a huge problem in the U.S., and I think we've gotten better over the last couple years, but when it first started being introduced, I think actually BuzzFeed was one of the best at deciphering or holding their content as different, but so many news organizations, and you still see it, it's sponsored content, and it's not labeled, so people are reading this as if it's an advertisement, especially if you scroll down to the bottom of websites, and there's all these kind of links that basically have just been written up because they got money from a company, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're influencing the content, but there's no disclosure there. And I think the biggest lesson is we don't want to confuse our users. If we're confusing them or they don't understand, that's gonna kind of lead them to maybe distrust you a little bit because they don't know what's going on. You've made it hard for them to see what they came there to find.
is all this labeling working? I mean, we keep saying that, well, we're labeling, you know, it's very clear and we've done research and they do. But if it still says that this is one of the things that will make you distrust a brand.
We have a lot of labels, but I'm not sure we necessarily take the time to explain what the labels mean. I mean, how many of your parents would be able to explain what does annonsørinnhold, advertiser paid content, actually mean, and what's the difference between that and journalism? I always say, go home and check it with your aunt, and that's a fairly, well, I have pretty smart aunts, and they are fairly good judges of what's hard to understand and not. It's the same thing with opinions. How many people understand what's a news analysis? For us, it's crystal clear. To the audience, it's not. So we need to take the time to actually explain the machinations and the logic behind our profession a whole lot more. So to me, this comes a whole lot down to communication from the newsroom and from the news industry to our audiences in order to maintain their trust. But it also comes down to taking the time to talking to your audience, which is, I don't know. I will say that as a profession and as an organization, we have a tendency towards arrogance that might not necessarily always be in our best interests.
One of our newsrooms tried the labeling. It was the Virginia pilot, and they did a really good job. They broke out every single label that they used, and they put it on a page, and they explained it. Every time they used the label, they would do some kind of editor's note, normally at the bottom, and then they would link to that page where they explained all the labels. But they still, when we asked their users questions, they still had a lot of negative feedback because people didn't understand labels. And they think, and they're not sure, they're still looking into this, they think, one, they have too many labels. They need to simplify it. It needs to be news, it needs to be opinion. This analysis means a lot of different things for many organizations. For the Washington Post, it means one thing. For the New York Times, it means something else. So that's confusing to users as they go across the different platforms. Also, where this becomes a problem is that label doesn't always populate over to social media, and that's really, really important. Unless you're putting the word opinion really big in the headline, that's not going to pull over to Facebook. And for a lot of news organizations, adding the word opinion to that is not good for search engine optimization, for Google search results, so they're not doing that. But so can you then in your post, can you develop a graphic? Can you make sure you're writing that word? So those are things that become harder to duplicate because you're adding, more staff members have to know how to do it, they have to remember how to do it, and it potentially is more work.
But can I just ask, how do you actually measure that you're successful? Because one thing is doing all these things, but does it actually work? What are the best ways of measuring it?
So right now we are in the middle of A/B testing. So if you're familiar with that, basically we are working with our news organizations to have them pick one story. The story will not have any kind of trusting news things added to it, so no editor's notes, no boxes, none of this language. The other story will, and then we're seeing basically if it resonates, if people remember, and if that makes them trust the story more or the news organization more. So we're in the middle of that right now and should be done by the end of the year or beginning of next year. So that's kind of the data, right, that we're still looking for. Everything that we've seen so far is questionnaires with users before and after, and then really getting a sense from the newsroom editors of how conversations have changed. And you can tell how tone in a comment section has changed, kind of mentioning once the editor or someone jumps into the conversation, how the comments, either the readers start defending the news organization, which was the complete opposite that was happening. They were being attacked before. Or you have just people saying thank you. So we have sort of that's not scientific, right, like this would be, but it is something that kind of based on how people are, what they're seeing with their relationships with their users.
Ingeborg?
I think what you're saying about how it transfers into social media is really important because we're used to being in charge of the formatting and the graphics and how everything looks and giving native advertising a different look and feel or giving opinion a different look and feel. But when it's in your Facebook feed, it all looks the same. So we've been really working on how to label our social media content to make sure that everything that's not news content has an explanation or a label. And we try to use the same labels as we do in the other sections. So if it's advertiser content, that's the marking. But we're also trying to mark it, to sort of label it if this is communication from the media house, that's not journalism. So whether this is a conference offering or if it's a subscription offering, you need to be made aware that, you know what's coming up right now is not journalism. So you need to take this at this value.
One question before we'll look a bit more at your research, but you talked about arrogance, Ingeborg, but there's a tendency when we when we explain why we do things, we get a bit pompous, like it's about the big stories and are we doing it for ourselves or are we doing it for the audience? And how can we make it more about the audience?
Well, let's think back to this morning, because we've been sitting here in this room of very qualified editors and talking about our vital role in democracy and society. And this is good, well and good for us, because we know what this means. But in journalism, we have a really good saying of show it, don't tell it. And I think in a lot of instances, when we come to taking this sort of idea into the public, we go about telling it instead of showing what we are doing to earn our place in society and democracy. I will agree that we tend to be pompous and we tend to use words that people don't understand because we presuppose. Well, we tend to surround ourselves with people who are sort of in the upper echelons of how society organizes itself. We tend to collaborate with scientists and researchers and politicians and industry leaders. And we sort of acquire their language and then we don't think enough about explaining. How many of your audiences would know the term samtidig imøtegåelse, which is a simultaneous contradiction, which is a standardized term in the Norwegian press code? They won't understand what that means, but they will understand that someone has a right to contradict something at the same point of publishing. We just need to find the language for it.
Yeah, something we encourage our news partners to do is, yes, it's good to talk about why journalism is important. I think we, haven't done that enough. Now we have in the U.S. after the 2016 election and the tax of fake news, but for years we just weren't really talking about it. So I think that is important. But when you do that, I think it's also important to ask for feedback while you're doing that. And that ask for feedback is something that so many of us forget to do. Just simple things like, what did you think of this story? Did we miss anything? If you just add that kind of language, it's conversational, and you're welcoming that feedback. I was talking to members of the public just last week at a panel in Stanford, and we said, the media really belongs to the public. In the US, it does. We cover what they are doing. We know about things because they bring it to our attention. So making that aware and telling them to participate and making it so it is participatory is so important, and it's something we're not doing enough. And I think if you talk about the way we are successful and the importance of it while asking for that participation, that really is where it becomes very helpful.
Erik, there was one other thing that you saw in your research, which might give hope to a few editors in the room, and also Ingeborg, with regards to newspapers.
Yeah. So if you take a look at, compared to being a website or a blog, online newspaper only, and having an online and an offline newspaper, there is, at least in Norway, some hope for. I would suggest to keep the offline newspaper for a while, at least. Keep in mind that the effect we see here controls for everything else. So in isolation, the effect of not having an offline newspaper is about 7% negative, 7 percentage points in a negative direction. So yeah, there's an argument there for keeping the offline one. And also, you don't really see it in the US, but we did another version where we took out the ethical violations one in the US because we saw that it took a lot of the effects. So when we removed that, we saw that actually there's more or less no difference between the United States and Norway. When it comes to the determinants, so what different determinants are important when we trust a newspaper? That is more or less exactly the same in the US and in Norway.
So there's
Well, it
some hope
really
there.
makes me regret leaving Norway's oldest newspaper.
But one other thing that you mentioned when we talked earlier was that there are different types. You have to work with audience in different ways depending on what kind of mistrust they have towards your brand or towards that. You could sort of split them into two categories. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so when you ask people about to what extent do you trust Aftenposten or NRK, so you have those in the upper level saying that they have high trust, and then you have those in the bottom level saying no trust at all or low trust. So what does that mean? Well, I just came from a conference in Lugano, a communication research conference, so we started exploring this more and more now, and there's not much research on it, but there will be. The idea is mistrust can be both healthy skepticism, so that, because we see that people use news that they don't trust. So if they still use it, it means that mistrust can mean something for someone and something else for someone. And you have the cynicism. Those are the people who are more likely to go to alternative media channels. So there's a challenge now to try to disentangle this complexity when it comes to mistrust that we are starting to understand, but still there's a long road ahead of us.
So maybe you actually have to do different things to target different types of mistrust.
Well, there are definitely different approaches to the people who are just really mad at you because they don't agree with your viewpoint or the idea behind your journalism in that specific case, or the people who don't understand it. Or the people who don't have any relationship with your brand or the idea of journalism. And what doesn't come into this is also about 10% of Norwegian populists who don't care about the news at all. The disinterested people who don't distrust news, they just don't care. And we need to think of a way to communicate with them as well. So I think we're going to have to address this on a lot of levels. One of the things I will advocate for is going out and meeting people. Actually talking to them, which is really educational for editors and journalists alike. We're in the process of finalizing a huge audience study at the end where we're in-depth interviewing 40 readers about potential readers I want to make sure that we don't only interview the people who already use us, but the people who we think should. And we are learning so much about their lives, about how they structure their day, what's important to them, what makes them angry, what annoys them, what makes them happy. And it's such a good kicking off point for good journalism that might be relevant to them. And then we also get those feedback, we get the feedback from really highly educated professionals saying, you know what, I tend to not read your newspaper because it makes me feel kind of stupid. And then that's a really important insight to us, because that's something we can address with content. And that's how we really like to solve anything, is how we go about the journalism.
Something I would add just really quickly, the in-person events were something that were very successful for the newsrooms that participated in our project. Just inviting, a couple newsrooms did this, and I know it does take time and it's something that can be time consuming, but even inviting them in for a morning meeting when you're making those decisions about story selection, having that insight, just them seeing the conversations that happen and how you choose stories was so helpful. They asked the people who visited questions afterward, and then just even gave them a tour of who people are, where they sit, and the fact that advertisers are upstairs and we're here, and that was just something that for a lot of people was really eye-opening and helpful.
Talk more to people, basically.
Well, we had a really good experience about a month back when we invited women in business to come and talk to us about how we can get more women in our journalism. And we did a big seminar on that, and also about what happens when you're contacted by a journalist. What are we looking for?
And are you sharing that with everyone? Will you share your, when you're measuring all the...
Well, we have been quite transparent in how we're going about this, but we kind of have to figure it out in our own journalism first. So once I've kind of cracked that code, we will. It's a constant struggle, but just the feeling that these 300 women got from us saying, you know what, we would really love to hear more from you. We would love to see more of you as our sources. And this is what happens if you call us, or this is what happens if you email us, means that not only can we see that some of them have become our ambassadors and are telling their friends that they should be talking to us, but we also get some really good stories out of it.
Right. That's very inspiring. We could continue this for another hour. Thank you so much, all of you, Ingeborg, Erik, and Lynn. You can continue talking to all of them, and Lynn will be around for lunch and throughout the evening. So if you want, maybe people can even participate in the research.
Yes,
in the project.
Yeah, that's something we're kind of still, like I said, we've only been doing it for about a year and a half. But if you ever want feedback or you want advice, please do not hesitate to contact us. Twitter, email, whatever is easiest. We would be glad to help or look at things.
Thank you.
Great research.